What's on your mind?
I wore real pants today, all day long, for absolutely no reason, other than the fact I have not worn pants all day long since March.
Now, just to be clear, you have worn clothes.
Oh yes, I've been wearing like pajama pants for the
Yep.
past 7 months, and it's been awesome. It's been so freeing. But I decided today was a special day, and I needed to wear real pants for a change. And I feel like I'm in like my teaching attire, and I haven't taught in person in since March. And I finally feel kind of like a teacher again. It's very exciting. What are you thinking about?
I'm thinking about books as objects. So, as a bookseller, you see and hear, unfortunately, a lot of people tell you, "Oh, I got this book on my Kindle," and it's my usual go-to when someone's like, "It's nice to have a real book instead of it being on Kindle." I'll say something like, "Well, yeah, because when you don't like a book and it's on your Kindle, you can't throw it across the room." And usually they're horrified that I would throw a book across the room, which I find very interesting, because I am very hard on my books. And I've always found that it's nice to have a book where you can see how much you've loved it.
Mm-hmm.
So
I agree.
that segues really nicely into what we're talking about today, which is books that have changed our lives and also kind of a bit of a background about each of us. So I will go first because I think mine, being a kid's book, sort of represents kids' books a little bit
Mm-hmm.
more. And I'm talking about Dealing with Dragons. Um, I have made a lot of decisions in my life that look pretty strange because of dealing with dragons. And I've made a lot of friends because of Dealing with Dragons. And if Allie and Allison ever watch this, hello, I miss you guys. Um, Dealing with Dragons is kind of a classic kids book at this point. It's about a princess, Princess Cimarine, who runs away from an arranged marriage because she's never been a proper princess. When she was young, she decided to learn Latin, and she decided to fence, and she decided to learn how to cook cherries jubilee, and she went to her father's cabinet meetings and stuff like that. She was always told, like, it's not proper, you can't do this. So she runs away and she ends up being a dragon's princess, which in this universe has a lot more to do with like being a dragon's personal assistant than being, like a captive Dasmal. And she just thrives there. And it's one of those books that change your life, and that I learned how to fence because of this book. And I took Latin in college, which was a huge mistake because of this book. It's a series, there's 4 books in it. I would say all of them are worth reading, but Dealing with Dragons is the first one, and that's the one I keep in the store. I don't remember when I read it first because I learned how to read when I was 4. My sister taught me, and books like Dealing with Dragons came from the library. I'd read them and then just be delighted. So reading for me has been, as long as I can remember, I have been reading. And this one in particular was one of so many books that just absolutely changed my life.
I remember you finally got me to read it at some point in middle school. I came to it way later than you did. And I read it and I was like, "Oh, this is kind of fun," but it never hit me the way it hit you. And it's one of those books that I absolutely adore, and I've kept my copies mostly because of how much you love it.
I guess we should also mention at this point that Gia and I have been friends for 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
I am now the events coordinator and the children's specialist at Readers Books, a job that Gia got me. Readers is located in Sonoma, California. It's a small, independent, new and used bookstore. I think I bought my copy of Dealing with Dragons there. I wouldn't be surprised. Um, and we've been friends this long because of books, in part. And it's been great, sort of the push and the pull between the two of us, and what we like to read and what we've given each other to read. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
never would have read your pick.
Mm-hmm. So I'm Gia Sorensen. I used to work at Readers back in the day. I worked there off and on for about 4 years, and The bookstore still has a really special place in my heart. But the first book I'm going to talk about, I didn't get the copy that I originally read from readers. I will say that. I actually got it from my brother. He handed it to me. But what I'm going to be talking about is the collected short stories and novels of Sherlock Holmes. I have them all in one volume now. And this volume actually did come from readers. It came in as a used book, and Andy saw it and he tentatively put a price on it. And then he looked at it again and he just handed it to me. So this is my copy of Sherlock Holmes that Andy gave to me. Anyway, this is actually a very special edition beyond the fact that Andy gave it to me. This is the first full single volume collection of Sherlock Holmes that ever existed. It came out sometime in the early 1950s. And it was the first time that all the stories were together in one place. So that's really exciting. For those of you who have somehow managed not to meet Sherlock Holmes yet, he is one of the first detectives, and the collected Sherlock Holmes are his cases. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of the Sherlock Holmes stories, was definitely a short story writer. So why is this one of my childhood books? It is not necessarily a book associated with childhood for most people, but I first read it in 6th grade. I was very late to reading, unlike Rosie. I didn't really learn how to read until the end of 2nd grade into 3rd grade, and I didn't actually start liking reading until 5th grade. So I read throughout 5th grade pretty well, but Sherlock Holmes was one of the first books that I actually devoured, right? I would sit around just reading Sherlock Holmes stories and not doing anything else. And so he's very special to me. And the stories are very special to me because in a lot of ways, they're the kind of beginning of my reading journey. There were a few books before him, but just not in the same way. And the process of reading Sherlock Holmes kind of encapsulates my reading abilities overall. I tried to read the first Sherlock Holmes short story probably 5 or 6 times, and I finally got through the first story and I was hooked. You couldn't get me to put down Sherlock Holmes for hours after that. And I was very lucky. My brother had the 2-volume complete Sherlock Holmes in little mass markets, so I was able to carry those around in my pockets everywhere and read them whenever I had a spare moment. But I love Sherlock Holmes. I have since I was very little. I was raised on the Sherlock Holmes movies and the Jeremy Brett TV show. So Sherlock Holmes is kind of the cornerstone of my childhood in a lot of ways. I can identify with Sherlock Holmes because he too is an expert in esoteric knowledge that not everybody has. And I can kind of, he's kind of a role model for me, right? He kind of trained himself to be the best in his field. And I've spent the last 7 years attempting to train myself to be the best I can be in my field. And what can I say? Sherlock Holmes has been my hero, and he has been for 20 years.
And I want to see the hat.
Oh, yeah. Lest you think I am not a true Sherlock Holmes fan, I do in fact own a deerstalker, which don't fit over my headphones, but there it is. I am wearing my Sherlock Holmes socks currently. And I do have a Sherlock Holmes t-shirt, but it didn't really show up on camera, so.
We were talking when we were trying to pick out these books, and we decided we need to do a whole video on the English department at Sonoma Valley High School. Taught us just the love of literature. I mean, we already loved words and we already loved stories, but literature can be a big hoop for people, and it can be a big scary thing, especially poetry. And at some point in high school, I came across First World War poetry, which was the first time I realized that poetry doesn't have to be pretty. Poetry might not be about pretty situations, and it might not be about pretty things. So I personally find the Penguin collection of First World poets really, really useful. People tend to think of the British poets. The Penguin edition has some of the German poets in translation. And it's good to remember that the men on both sides of the war were dealing with similar things, similar horrors that had never been around before. And I'm just going to read the first stanza of my favorite World War I poem, which I believe we came across in 10th grade. And it's Dulce decorum est. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched to sleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshaw. All were lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. It's a wonderful poem. It's a series of sonnets, and it just really brings home that words aren't just for telling pretty things, and poems can tell you much more than just like a love poem or a happy poem. You can also understand the despair of humanity in them.
I assigned Dulce decorum est to one of my literature classes, and they were flabbergasted. I really think it was the first time they had come across anti-war poetry. I mean, at its heart, Dulce decorum est is an anti-war poem. And my students were just horrified by it. And I mean, that to me is a really important teaching moment, right? Is to help students see that for the first time.
And I think one of the things we learned in high school, and we were lucky to learn in high school, is that poems aren't in this existence that's in a scary realm of literature that you can never find accessible. Like there's something of a friend in good poetry, and sometimes it's a friend that's screaming for help, like Wilfred Owen was, and sometimes it's just a friend who's giving you good thoughts and good advice, but it's not something to be scared of. And we were lucky to learn that, and it was life-changing to learn that.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about a rather different poet. I'm going to talk about Edna St. Vincent Malay, and this is the selection of poems that I first read. This edition is out of print, but we will link you to a different edition of her selected poems that has most of the same poems. I actually first encountered Edna St. Vincent Malay in middle school. My mom suggested I read her, but I didn't really kind of learn to love her or read her until high school. And when I did, I was really struck by the way that she talks about love, because she doesn't have a like straightforward love poem. All of her love poems are very complicated, but also very angry. But she also writes really beautifully about nature and about kind of the lessons that nature can teach us, which I didn't actually really notice until I was much older. I now study environmental literature almost exclusively. So I encounter a lot of poetry that talks about nature and that situates nature as a refuge. And I think Edna St. Vincent Malay is a really fascinating nature poet because she has some of those elements of nature as a place I can go and be safe and be comfortable. But she's also very aware that nature is very scary and uncomfortable. And I think that she pairs that really well with a deep-seated anger about injustice. So many of her poems are about the injustices experienced by people who are poor, immigrants, gender. She's very angry in most of her poems, and that was a good thing to read as a high schooler. I mean, it's good to encounter that level of anger and realize the world could be very different than it is. Yeah, and I think, prose can teach us a lot about other people's experiences, but I really think poetry shines when it's teaching us something about emotions, particularly about emotions are really complex. Happiness doesn't just equal happiness, right? There's a lot of things that have to go into being happy, being sad, being angry. And I really appreciate the way that we were taught poetry and kind of given the chance to understand that from such an early age. I'm going to read a very kind of bizarre sonnet that I have loved since high school. To this day, I don't exactly know what it means. That's probably on me. But I still love it, and I still return to it pretty often. I think about it quite a bit. So this is one of her unnamed sonnets. She wrote several sonnet cycles and didn't name any of the poems, but it's a sonnet. I will put chaos into 14 lines and keep him there, and let him thence escape if he be lucky. Let him twist and ache flood, fire, and demon. His adroit designs will strain to nothing in the strict confines of this sweet order, where, in pious rape, I hold his essence in amorphous shape, till he with order mingles and combines. Past are the hours, the years of our duress, his arrogance, our awful servitude. I have him. He is nothing more nor less than something simple, not yet understood. I shall not even force him to confess or answer. I will only make him good. And that's Edna St. Vincent Malay for you in a nutshell.
This is such a convenient poem for you to read and a convenient poet for you to choose, because Edna St. Vincent Malay went to my college. After high school, our lives kind of split off quite a bit, because I went straight to college. I went to Vassar College, which is in Poughkeepsie, New York. And I was an English and Victorian studies double major. And I knew I would be an English major because obviously I would be an English major. Like that was pretty much preordained. But I took a 200 level class on Victorian literature the second semester of college. And the professor, I don't remember her name. I wish I remember her name. She always wore knee-high leather boots and like a plaid kind of shortish skirt. She was in her early 60s and she had poofy permed bright red dyed hair, and she was about 5'0" and one of the hardest professors I have had in college. She was definitely the sort of person who made you think. One of the books we read for her class was Wuthering Heights, which I have a really pretty copy. Penguin did these cloth bound ones that I frankly love. If I could have every classic in the cloth bound versions, I totally would. Wuthering Heights, it's a really weird book and you don't like any of the characters, but somehow the story is wonderful. It's like watching The Bachelorette. Like you don't actually like any of them, but the drama of it is so good. And there's ghosts and there's big mad dogs and there's strange generations with people of the same name. And it's the right level of complicated for someone just starting out thinking about Victorian times and thinking about what that means. I like to say I was a Victorian studies major because I really care about modernism. It's a way to think about it in context. You can't really understand James Joyce. You can't really understand Wilfred Owen if you don't understand Wuthering Heights. And that sort of gives you a good balance between them. You've read Wuthering Heights though, right?
I did. So I read it as part of my education, my PhD education. And I think, interestingly, I didn't read it in a class. I read it on my own. And I think it's a very difficult book to not have anyone to talk to when you're reading it. Partially because, as you're saying, multiple generations have the same name. And so keeping track of people starts being kind of a like family tree guessing game.
You need a gossip friend
to
read Wuthering Heights. You know,
yeah.
You need a oh, I can't believe he did this.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah.
They're all awful people.
Yes.
Yes. And I think the reason I brought up my professor for this class is we were at the very beginning where Catherine, the ghost, is rattling the windows of the visitor from down south. And the professor went to our old antique glass windows and just shook them while reading it out loud. And it was just, I still think about her to this day with her awful handwriting and her big cloud of like crazy witchy hair and just shaking the windows like she was Catherine. And it was good. It was a good way to read books.
Mm-hmm. It helps with a lot of those hard books to have someone be able to guide you through in that way, because it really helps you kind of pin down the scenes that you need to pin down, and then everything kind of starts finally falling into place.
So what changed my college life. Shortly after that, there's a very small department at Vassar called the Victorian Studies Department, which spans the English department, the art history department, the history department. And you just sort of study 19th century culture, British culture, Western culture in particular. I think I read some Russians that counted as well, but because of that double major, I have this really unique view on literature in general, like that you can place things in context before Victorian and after Victorian, but it was a long enough time period that there's a lot of meat on that bone to think about.
My college career took a very different trajectory, as we hinted. I went to junior college for 3 years immediately out of high school. And I worked during that time, and it was a fascinating time because I was able to slow down my education by quite a bit. I went to junior college to get a whole bunch of my general ed classes out of the way. But it also meant that I could experiment with a lot of different classes that I wouldn't have had time for at a different institution. So I took a bunch of philosophy classes. I took a bunch of anthropology classes. And obviously I took a bunch of English classes because I ended up being an English major. But going to the junior college and being able to take classes in so many different departments was amazing for me because I was able to learn so much more about the world than I had been able to up until that point. And I'm very appreciative of my time at junior college, and kind of all I did there and all I read there. But I think the most important thing that I actually ended up reading at junior college, I did not read for a class. I read this on my own. And it was the essays of George Orwell. The first thing that I was able to read, it was actually a book that was lent to me by a family friend. The second essay actually begins, "As I write, highly civilized human beings are flying overhead trying to kill me." And I read that, and it was one of the few moments where I read something and I had to stop. I put the book down and I just had to think about that sentence for probably 5 minutes. And I still remember I was outside on the second story of the English building at my junior college. And I still remember, like, it was a cold day. It was foggy out. I remember staring out over the balcony and just repeating these words over and over in my head because it was just the most astonishing thing I'd ever read. So lucky for me, that year, George Packer, who's a very famous political writer nowadays, he edited a 2-volume set of George Orwell's essays. And these are among my most prized possessions at this point. It's one of those things where, like, if I had to evacuate because of a hurricane or something, these would be among the books that I would grab because they mean so much to me. The first one I bought was Facing Unpleasant Facts. This is a selection of George Orwell's narrative essays. And it actually has a big section of excerpts from his journals. He tried very, very hard to keep a journal throughout World War II every single day. And it's a really good way to think about and learn about World War II history as it's unfolding. Because as George Orwell points out, he's going to make assumptions about what's going to happen. He's going to be wrong. And what better way to kind of keep track and keep himself honest than to have a journal to kind of look back on. But his narrative essays, it's a fantastic collection because it also contains one of my favorite essays ever written, and that is Some Thoughts on the Common Toad, which is one of the most hopeful and beautiful essays I've ever read in my entire life. And it's basically, the world sucks. I mean, it's the middle of World War II. It's the middle of the Blitz in England. George Orwell is living in London, so he gets bombed nightly. And he writes this essay that basically says, everything is horrible right now, but it's springtime. And we can, no matter what, depend that springtime will come again, and the frogs will come out again. They will unearth themselves from their little mud pits, and there's still hope, and there's still the possibility for more. And it's a gorgeous essay. He has another essay about trees that I absolutely adore, where he basically says, you don't plant a tree for yourself, you plant a tree for the next generation. And it's beautiful. It's a beautiful collection. I can't recommend it enough. I love it. The second volume are his critical essays, All Art is Propaganda. These are a little bit tougher. He is a amazing writer, obviously, but he does some very scholarly writing. I mean, he does literary analysis, he does film reviews, he does a lot of political commentary. It's all very, very good, but it is, it takes a lot of work to get through. But honestly, George Orwell is probably one of the most important people I've ever read. He is, I don't know, he's who I try to write like whenever I write any nonfiction. He wrote that good prose should be transparent like a window pane. And that has always been my guiding light for anything I've ever written. Try and make it clear, try and make it succinct, and try and help people understand things just a little bit better. So that's George Orwell.
I would like to point out that I have these
in paperback, though.
I know I have them in paperback, but you only convinced me to buy them when they were in paperback.
Yeah, honestly, these did both come from readers. They came out in 2008. I bought them from readers. I had to save up for them. I mean, I was a broke college kid, so I had to buy them. I think like 6 months apart. That was, I mean, I don't have a lot of money, so I had to save up for them. If you want to see more of our conversations where we talk about the most exceptional books that we have encountered, then you should like this video and you should subscribe to the Reader's YouTube channel so you'll get notified as soon as we post a new video.
And the Reader's YouTube channel will also have records of all of the Zoom events that we host. And one day, maybe, we'll allow to go back to letting people in, and I'll try and also film those. And we'll put those clips up on YouTube as well, just to sort of spread the joy a little bit more. It's been the one good thing of having to learn how to do online events, in that I can share them further and that more people can see the cool people that live in our town, or my town, because Gia doesn't live here anymore.
I don't live here anymore.
So if you have other books in your life that have absolutely changed the trajectory of where you were going or who you were as a person, please put it in the comments below. I'll take a look at them throughout, I don't know, the next week or so, and we'll have a good conversation about what they are. So thank you very much, and thank you for watching. Goodbye. Yeah, we did it.